When you complain, you think you're relieving yourself of a burden. You think you're pushing some of that weight out into the world so others can help carry it. But in truth, every time you complain, you're reinforcing something subtle but profoundly destructive. You're teaching your mind to believe that the problem is greater than you, that your role is to suffer under it, that the real responsibility lies somewhere else, on the world, on fate, other people. Complaining is the language of resignation disguised as expression. And the more you use it, the more you solidify the identity of someone who has no control over their own life. Now this isn't to say that you should never speak about difficulties. There's a difference between describing a problem in pursuit of a solution and rehearsing the problem to justify your frustration. One builds clarity and responsibility, the other builds helplessness. Complaining belongs to the latter, and the human mind is far more plastic than we realize. What you repeat, you become. Every complaint is like carving another groove into the neural circuitry of victimhood. Over time, those grooves become deep enough that even when the sun is shining, even when there is nothing seriously wrong, you can't help but notice shadows. At its core, complaint is an abdication of responsibility. It's saying, this difficulty is greater than me, and so I must outsource my power to sympathy or to external change. But human beings don't grow strong by outsourcing their power. They grow strong by facing their burdens directly, acknowledging what is within their control and bearing the weight of what isn't with as much grace as they can muster. When you complain, you remove yourself from that process. You lose the opportunity to stand taller beneath the load. There's also something corrosive that complaint does socially. People rarely admire the one who always has a grievance. They tolerate them, maybe even pity them, but pity is not the same as respect. Respect is reserved for those who bear their struggles without needing to constantly announce them. You've met these people. They move through the world with quiet strength. They have suffered, but they don't wield that suffering like a weapon against others. Instead, they carry it like a shield. They inspire because they are proof that pain does not have to turn into bitterness. And you can see the opposite as well, people who let every wound become an opportunity to broadcast their misery. The difference between the two is not circumstance, it's choice. From a psychological perspective, complaint feeds a dangerous cycle of externalization. The more you dwell on what's unfair, the more unfair the world seems. The more you emphasize what's wrong, the less energy you have left for what could be made right. Attention is a limited resource, and where you place it determines the quality of your life. Complaint focuses attention on what strips you of power. Responsibility focuses attention on what grants you strength. Which one you choose is not trivial. It determines the architecture of your character. Philosophically, complaint is tied to an illusion, the belief that life should be easier than it is. But life has never been easy. It has always demanded sacrifice, endurance, and courage. To complain is in a way to rebel against reality itself. And reality is indifferent to rebellion. It won't bend just because you don't like it. So every act of complaint is really just wasted breath, a kind of self-sabotage dressed up as catharsis. There's something far more powerful than complaining when you're wronged or burdened. It's facing the difficulty silently with dignity and using it as fuel. Think of the person who works in obscurity, without applause, who never asks for sympathy, but instead channels their suffering into persistence. They become formidable because they are not distracted by resentment. Their struggle makes them sharper, more grounded, more resilient. That is the kind of character that emerges when you resist the temptation to complain. And here's the irony. The less you complain, the more people actually listen, and when you do speak about something important, your words carry weight because they are not cheapened by constant grievances. Silence makes your speech meaningful, just as restraint makes your strength undeniable. So the next time you feel the urge to complain, pause for a moment, ask yourself, what am I reinforcing here? Am I training myself to see only the unfairness, or am I training myself to take responsibility? Because those little decisions matter. Every complaint is a rehearsal of weakness. Every refusal to complain is a rehearsal of strength. Day by day, you're either becoming someone who is diminished by difficulty or someone who is fortified by it. And if you want a rule to live by, let it be this. When life hands you more weight than you think you can carry, don't waste time telling everyone how heavy it is. Just carry it, because in the end, no one remembers the person who complained about the storm. They remember the one who walked through it without losing their composure. There's a strange urge in human beings to constantly justify themselves. You see it everywhere. People rush to explain their decisions, their mistakes, even their successes. They believe that if they don't provide a reason, if they don't quickly defend their actions, then others will think less of them. But beneath that impulse to explain lies something deeper, insecurity. The unspoken belief is that I am not enough as I am, so I must make you understand why I am the way I am. That instinct is not strength, it's a confession of weakness. Now consider the opposite. Think of someone who doesn't scramble to explain themselves, who doesn't rush to smooth over every possible misunderstanding. What do you feel in their presence? Usually, it's a sense of composure, of groundedness, of quiet strength. When someone refuses to over-explain, they signal something profound. They are not dependent on others' immediate approval. They are content to let their actions speak, and actions over time always speak louder than explanations. When you constantly explain yourself, you surrender authority. You place the power of judgment entirely in the hands of others. You make their perception of you more important than your own integrity. It's as if you're saying, I exist only as you see me, and so I must work tirelessly to adjust your vision. But that's a losing game. You can never fully manage how you're perceived. People will always project their biases, their insecurities, their own distortions onto you. If you chase their approval by over-explaining, you will exhaust yourself and still fail. Silence, on the other hand, communicates that you are anchored in something deeper than public opinion. There's a psychological reality here worth noticing. The more you explain, the less believable you often become. Think about it. When someone insists again and again, I didn't mean to, I promise I really didn't, what happens? Suspicion grows. But when someone speaks simply, directly, and then stops, their words hold more weight. Excess explanation is like watering down a truth until it loses its potency. The discipline of restraint, of letting words end before they become defensive, creates clarity and trust. Philosophically, this ties back to the concept of sovereignty over the self. A sovereign individual does not beg others to understand them. They live in accordance with their values, they act consistently, and they let the integrity of their life be the explanation. This doesn't mean arrogance or disregard for others' perspectives. It means that validation is not the foundation of their being. The foundation is character, discipline, and action. If you need to constantly explain yourself, it's because you have not yet built enough trust in your own foundation. There's also a social dynamic to consider. People who over-explain invite others to see them as fragile. If you are always justifying your choices, others begin to assume you lack confidence in them yourself. But when you speak plainly and then leave silence in your wake, people notice. Silence makes others reflect. It creates space for respect. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is not to argue or justify, but simply to hold your ground without elaboration. And here's something paradoxical. When you stop explaining unnecessarily, you become more understandable. Your words are fewer, but they carry clarity. Your actions align with your character, and people see the pattern. Over time, the need for explanation fades because your life itself explains you. That's the irony. When you live with integrity, your silence becomes more persuasive than 1,000 justifications. But to do this requires courage. It's frightening to sit in silence while others misunderstand you or even criticize you. It's tempting to leap in with words to try to repair their perception. Yet every time you resist that urge, you build strength. You teach yourself that you can withstand being misjudged. And that resilience is one of the most powerful qualities you can possess. Because the truth is, you will be misjudged in life. You will be criticized unfairly. You cannot stop that. What you can control is how much of yourself you give away in trying to fight those battles. When you choose silence, you choose mastery. You learn to discern when words are necessary and when they are not. You learn that most of the time, the demand to explain is not about truth, but about others' need to control your narrative. And you learn that giving them that control is never worth it. So when you feel that desperate need to justify yourself, pause, ask whether the explanation is truly necessary or if it's just insecurity in disguise. If it's the latter, hold your ground. Let your life be the proof. Because in the long run, the person who explains less is remembered more. Their silence becomes a kind of gravity that pulls respect toward them. And that's the point worth carrying forward. Strength is not shown in how loudly you defend yourself, but in how calmly you live in a way that needs no defense. If you refuse to complain and you refuse to explain, what are you left with? You're left with responsibility. You're left with the raw fact that your life is yours and that what you carry, you must carry. That's where the true depth of this principle lies. It isn't about being stoic for the sake of appearance or silent just to look strong. It's about understanding that every moment you are alive, you are shaping yourself. Every thought, every word, every action, each of them is chiseling away at the character you will one day be. If you fill that life with excuses, with complaints, with explanations meant to soothe insecurity, then you are chiseling away weakness into stone. But if you take up responsibility, if you bear your burdens directly, then what you carve out over time is a figure of strength. The refusal to complain and explain is not cold detachment, it's discipline, it's self-mastery. To master yourself means you no longer let circumstance dictate your attitude, and you no longer let the judgment of others dictate your worth. You recognize that what matters most is not how comfortable you are in this moment, but what kind of person you are becoming across a lifetime. And that requires sacrifice. It means resisting the easier path of excuses and instead shouldering responsibility fully. You see, responsibility is the antidote to helplessness. When you choose to take responsibility, even for things that may not be entirely your fault, you are reclaiming agency. You are saying, whatever has happened, I still have the power to determine how I will respond. And I will bear that burden willingly. That willingness transforms difficulty into growth. You don't grow in comfort. You grow underweight. You grow when the task seems heavier than you can bear, and you discover that you can, in fact, bear it. And this is not just psychological, it's philosophical. Human beings are defined by what they can carry. Life itself is suffering, as every tradition, every philosophy, every serious psychology has acknowledged. To live is to struggle, but in that struggle lies meaning. And if you carry it with dignity, without complaint, without explanation, then you become something more than a victim of circumstance. You become a master of yourself. You embody the idea that strength is not given, it is forged. And now people often say, but isn't it unfair to take responsibility for what isn't my fault? And the answer is yes, it is unfair. Life is unfair. But what's the alternative? To abandon responsibility. To cast yourself adrift in resentment, that doesn't liberate you. It chains you to bitterness. By contrast, if you embrace responsibility, even unfair responsibility, you rise above it. You transform yourself into someone who is not diminished by misfortune, but elevated by it. That's the paradox. You grow most when you willingly bear what you had every right to reject. And here's the truth. People notice. They might not say it outright, but when they encounter someone who has taken full responsibility for their life, who does not waste time in complaint or justification, they feel the weight of that presence. It commands respect, it inspires without needing to preach, because the life itself is the sermon. You don't have to tell others who you are, they can see it. Your integrity is self-evident. But this isn't easy. In fact, it's among the hardest disciplines you can practice, because everything in you wants to complain when life crushes you. Everything in you wants to explain when people misunderstand you. And everything in you wants to avoid responsibility when it feels too heavy. But that's why this principle matters, because in resisting those impulses, you become something stronger than impulse. You become intentional. You become someone whose character is not dictated by circumstance, but by choice. So imagine this, a life lived without excuses, a life where you meet suffering not with complaint, but with courage. A life where you meet misunderstanding not with frantic explanation, but with calm silence. And a life where you meet responsibility not with avoidance, but with resolve. That is not an easy life, but it is a meaningful one. And in the end, meaning is what sustains us. Pleasure fades, comfort disappears, but meaning, that endures. So let this principle be more than a phrase. Let it be a way of life. Never complain. Never explain. Not because the world demands it, but because your own soul does. Because to live otherwise is to weaken yourself, and to live this way is to fortify yourself. Carry your burdens willingly. Speak only when necessary. Take responsibility fully. Do this, and you will discover a strength you never knew you had. And if there's one final thought to hold on to, let it be this: excuses die, but character remains. Build character.